Hello and welcome to Photo Education Online. Today we're going to talk about understanding exposure. We've only got 10 minutes with YouTube here, so we'll try and move through it really quickly and give you kind of the basics. I teach a photography class here in Dallas a couple of times a year for beginners, and one of the questions that always comes up is, what are all these things on the dial of my camera, all these letters and the pictures and things like that? And so we're going to kind of talk about what those are. And they're all going to relate to exposure for the most part. And so before we talk about that, we need to kind of understand what we're doing with exposure. Exposure is basically the combination of shutter speed and aperture. Shutter speed is how long the shutter is open. Aperture is how big the opening is in the lens. So you're determining how much light is passing through that lens and hitting inside the camera to either expose your film or hit the digital sensor, and the combination of those two gives you your exposure, and you can adjust both. You can take the aperture and open it wider and smaller, or you can have a fast shutter speed or a slow shutter speed. So you can use both of those to end up with the same exposure, and kind of look at the two parts of that. The first part is aperture, also known as f-stop, and what that is the opening in the camera that is actually letting the light pass through. A lot of times on the side of your lens you'll notice the numbers 22, 16, 11. Those are all f-stops that are basically telling you how big of an opening you've got in your camera. Kind of illustrate that, if you've ever looked at the back of your lens, look through the lens, you can twist and change the aperture and you'll see that hole closing down and opening back up. So closing down all the way down to there would probably be like f22. All the way back open would be like f2.8. And so basically it's going to affect how much light is coming through that lens, and obviously the more light coming through, the less time you're going to need to leave the shutter open. So when we look at aperture, it's going to really affect two things. The first, like we talked about, is basically the quantity of light. How much light is passing through that lens. It's kind of like a hose. If you've got a garden hose or a fire hose, a lot more water is going to be passing through that fire hose because it's a lot bigger than a little garden hose. So the quantity of light's the big thing. The other side of that is depth of field. And if you look at that image to the right of the hedges, you'll notice that the image right there on the left is really sharp, and then it drops off as it falls away. And what that's from is from a relatively shallow depth of field, which is the depth of field is basically how much of the image depth-wise is in focus. And you can see we've got a really short area in focus of basically that first hedge is in focus and then starts falling off away from that. So we would call that a really shallow depth of field. That's caused by using a wide open lens, a wide open aperture on your lens, like a f2.8. So what you can do is kind of remember it by the smaller numbers are going to have a smaller depth of field. Like a f2.8 or f4 are going to have a really small depth to them versus an f22, which would show you all the way back in focus. Here's an example at the other end of f22, which would give you sharp from the front all the way to the back. It's a deep focus, deep depth of focus. So shutter speed, which is the other side of the equation, is going to control two things. One is the quantity of the light. Once again, how long you leave that shutter open affects how much light comes through. Much like our example with the hose, having your hose on for a minute versus 5 minutes is going to affect how much water passes through that hose. And so the same thing with the shutter. How long it's open is going to affect how much light comes through. The other thing, though, is that it can affect how well it freezes action. You're going to need a pretty fast shutter speed if you want to capture things like someone running or someone swinging a bat or something that's moving and you want to catch it sharp. You're going to need to have a relatively fast shutter speed. If you're wanting to blur something, like you're at a stream and you want it to really look soft and smooth and the water to kind of blur, you might use like a 1/15 of a second or an 1/8 of a second, a really slow shutter. And so those are going to balance out the shutter speed or the aperture. And again, you can see in this example, we've put the aperture at the other end, so it's like f22, which is going to give us a slower shutter speed. But the way you offset that slow shutter speed when you're taking a shot like this is you just use a tripod, so you can't really tell between the two images since they were both shot on a tripod. So now we come back to that camera dial and what all these buttons are on it and how they work. And so when you look at it, you've got the MASP going around the dial there on the right side, and then you've got a whole bunch of little pictures. And what those are is basically exposure settings, and it's, for example, the one just above auto on the left at about, I guess about 8 o'clock, is a woman in a hat. It's upside down. That would be portrait. That's basically you're telling it I want to do a portrait, so it's going to set the settings according to that. You see at the top at about 12 o'clock, you see a guy running. That's obviously for sports or things like that. And so sometimes you can just go by the picture and you tell it that's what you want to do and it makes the right settings for you, but that's not really giving us a whole lot of control. We want to be able to control things. So we're going to stick with the MASP there on the right hand side, more specifically the MAS part. But we'll start with P, which stands for program, much like those icons. Program is basically taking the control out of your hands, and the camera's making all the decisions. It's deciding how much aperture to use for the image, how long to leave the shutter open to make sure you get a good exposure. So it's doing all the thinking for you. All you're doing is worrying about composition and timing the shot and that type thing, which can be nice in some situations, but you lose creative control. Aperture priority, or the A on the dial there, is basically where you're taking on half the equation. You're going to decide what the f-stop is, and the camera is going to decide what the shutter speed is. So you have control over how much depth of field you want. Do you want it to be really shallow where just your subject is sharp and everything drops out of focus behind them, or maybe it's a landscape and you want everything to be sharp from front to back. So you're going to make those decisions and then let the camera worry about the shutter speed. The opposite of that is shutter priority, which is an S or sometimes a T. And what that means is basically the opposite. You're going to decide on the shutter speed, and the camera is going to decide on the f-stop. So if you know you want to blur something, or you know you want the fastest shutter possible, you can make those settings on the camera, and then the computer will go back in and think about it and say, okay, well then you need this aperture, and the camera will switch to that. So those are kind of the exact same thing from doing it from opposite sides, which leads to the other end of the spectrum from program, which is manual, which is the M. And what manual is basically you're doing all the making all the decisions. You're deciding the shutter speed and the f-stop. Usually when you look through the camera, you'll see a little meter in there that tells you you're over or underexposed, and you'll just use that to dial everything in. The way you can use this is what you might do is you might be an aperture priority, and you take a shot at f8 at a 60th of a second, and it's just a little darker than what you want. By going into manual mode, you can go in and decide which one you want to change and say, well, instead of f8, let me just open up a little bit to 5.6 and then take another shot. And so that way, if the computer is not calculating exactly the exposure that you want for that scene, you can go in and override it. So the advantage to manual, of course, is you've got full control of the situation. The downside is it's more difficult. So those are kind of the four main things you're working with. What I would suggest you do is start with probably aperture priority and play around with adjusting your depth of field and seeing, take the same shot 2 different times, one wide open at 2.8 or f4, f5.6, and then one at f22, and then look at them in the computer afterwards and decide which look you like better, and notice how that affected your shutter speed and that type thing. It's a good place to start, and then once you get more comfortable with that, maybe you move to manual. But that's basically how it works. I hope that helps some. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me an email, and I'll try and get that answered for you. And I hope you'll check back for more tutorials in the future. Thanks. Bye-bye.